So now, I just spent some few words to introduce Lorenzo, who doesn't need large presentation because you all know him very well. He's a very famous social movement scholar, and Lorenzo is an associate professor in sociology at Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. He has a PhD from Queen's University. He worked at the University of Kent as a Jean Monnet and Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship, and with a Jean Monnet and Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship. He works mainly in the area of political sociology, pursuing a comparative analysis and cross-disciplinary investigation of social movements and political violence. He directed many national and international projects related to social movements, political violence, and political participation. He's a research fellow of the Cosmos, the Center on Social Movement Studies, that now is at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. He's in the board of the journals Mobilization and Partecipazione e Conflitto. And he worked extensively in topics such as political violence, activist trajectories, direct action, and crossing many different fields and doing particularly qualitative research and based on oral. Also, we were discussing now with a very important element of oral history also. And so, okay, I think that now I can stop. I already talked much, and I give the floor to Lorenzo, who will present the paper. His work that he worked on with Anna Lavizzari, and on how young activists responded to the first wave of the COVID crisis in Italy. Thank you very much, and enjoy the sessions. And after, we will move to questions and answers. So now, okay, I move from.
Grazie, Guya. Is okay? What is? Probably it's my turn. There's something over there, but
Right?
yeah,
Crazy, right?
no, there is something, but it's no.
No. Maybe someone who didn't turn off the mic. Yeah.
Whatever. Ah, yeah, you're right. Now we are used for the mask. But thanks a lot, and thanks to Guya and Tiago for organizing this seminar and to allow us to have this opportunity to present this work that we have prepared with Anna Lavizzari. I'm trying to share the full screen. Here we are. I hope also that from home you can hear me. I want to introduce this paper by saying that in part is an outcome of a project that we had with Anna Lavizzari a few years ago. Between 2017 and 2019, we were involved in an Horizon 2020 project, Eureka, that was mainly like interested in youth political participation. And I was responsible on for the project on the working package on biographical interviews with young people between 18 and 35 years old, in coordinating the 9 teams of the project that were involved. And the main objective of this working package was mainly like to move beyond participation versus non-participation dichotomy. That is what is mainly like driving the literature on youth participation, is this major question, where like we were trying to suggest to look at the focus on trajectories of participation across different political organization domains. That was the aim of that working package. And one of the outcome of that working package is an article we wrote with Anna and with Stefania Voli, and that has been published in 2021. While we were doing our part of the job for the Italian case, we were already like thinking, you know, to be loyal to the idea of looking at trajectories of participation of our young activists, and we were thinking of running interviews with our respondents a few years after, even after the end of the project. That was our aim, and that was also like how we left the fieldwork after the first round of interviews. We were saying like to our respondents, look, if for you is okay, we will come back and we will ask you like again to like be interviewed and to answer few interviews, few questions. What we didn't expect, of course, was like that the pandemic was coming, and that was a further reason to, you know, do a second round of interviews. But that was something not expected. Was like what we suggest is a critical event, building on an article written by Susan Stackenberg back in 1993. Stackenberg defines critical events as sudden contextual changes that alter the expectation and perception that drive everyday activities and that may or may not result in actual political change. Stackenberg, speaking about critical events, refers also like to events as pandemic, but she refers also like to events as regime change, as a revolution, as Guya has looked, even like economic crisis, as we have experienced before the COVID crisis. Another critical event of these days can be considered the current war in Ukraine. So our research question at the empirical level is, how did the young activists respond to the COVID-19 crisis? But at a more like analytical level, beyond the empirical case, our interest is to look whether like activists, and in this case young activists, respond somehow differently, like in terms of their form of participation and their trajectories of participation once a critical event happens. And so we decided to run a second round of interviews. Where in the first fieldwork, we were able to interview 40 people, 30 young people involved in 9 different political organizations in the contest of in the Bologna contest. In the second round of interview, we were like interviewing 16 of these respondents that we have met in 2018, and we have met yet again, like in between June and July 2020. Like you should know that by May 2020, the lockdown that was established by the Italian government was put to an end, and so was allowing us also to meet these young people for interviews. Some of them preferred still like to do like online interviews between June and July 2020. So some of the interviews were also run online. Our expectation moving into the field, we were expecting to have that the activists that we were going to interview would have experienced a notable impact in terms of their trajectory of participation. With this, we mean we were expecting them to have, for example, disengaged from political participation, from where we have met them back in 2018. We were expecting them to have transferred from one organization to another. We were expecting them to have shifted somehow like their trajectory of participation. But our first empirical result was that actually among the 16 interviewees that we were able to like to meet, and then we can also like speak in the after with regarding also like the broader sample. But now in the presentation I will refer to these 16 interviewees. They didn't have shown any like significant shift in their trajectory of participation in consequence of the critical event, the COVID crisis. And this is clearly like, you know, a first empirical result. Another result is that among the all our interviewees, what we have discovered is that they were all like referring to three major interrelated themes that were time reappropriation, care practice, and digital activism. And I will briefly introduce these. But apart from the relevance of these three empirical observations, what was particularly interesting for us is that they were referring to these three different themes during the interviews, somehow differently according to where they were in terms of their trajectories of participation. So at the end of the day, this paper that I'm going to further like present here somehow says that there is no single response to the COVID crisis and to critical events, but variation is a stake. Okay, so what the literature and I would say like a limited part of the literature has looked at the participation and participation in the aftermath of critical events, have mainly like presented as an effect somehow like homogeneous responses to critical events. What we do like is suggesting that actually activists, and in this case young activists, respond to critical events differently depending on the trajectories of their own participation. I will briefly like present the three empirical observations that were coming out of the interviews, and probably like the time reappropriation was what at least for us was more like interesting or at least was unexpected but very, very similar to other experience of the past. The pandemic crisis provided the opportunity, so our interviews say, to interrupt or at least to slow down their pace of life. This critical awareness gave way to a feeling of time reappropriation, which has allowed the young activists to assert their agency as individuals by rethinking how to organize their everyday lives and their participation in activism during the current crisis and in the future. Here you have a quote from a respondent who was also like suggesting in a previous part of the interviews that activism for her is somehow like as a drug, meaning that there is an addiction to like activism, and that there is a time that is devoted to participation, to activism, that is very important. And young activists in all their interviews were suggesting that when the COVID crisis arrived and when the lockdown was implemented, they were like having like 2-3 weeks of break, and that was an opportunity, something very positive. Even like, you know, critically, you know, reading that positive by thinking like, well, we are getting back our time, but there are people obviously like outside that are suffering. But by speaking about their own life, they were able to do things that for years they were not able to do. So the lockdown gave me time and made me ask for things accordingly connected to the macro question, but what do I want? So like finally being able to like do like ask also like a planning for her life. And this is if you know a bit, for example, the work on political violence, is very interesting to see like that armed activists, when they are when they the police or the army is taking them to the jail, somehow like saying something very similar. The jail was a time where like we were able to like have time to reflect, and something very different from when they were underground and in constant activism. Obviously, like the type of activism is different, the type of pressure is different, but this opportunity to have the time to reflect is something very interesting that was coming out of these interviews with the young activists we have met. Obviously, I don't think there is much to say here, but care practices were like part of the repertoires that were like majoritarian in that moment, given the inadequacy of public service. Both existing political organization and newly formed one focused mostly on attempting to help people in need through a widespread proliferation of care practices. These were understood by our interviewees as an opportunity to restructure radically how society works by moving beyond the extreme individualism of neoliberal capitalism and toward a post-pandemic society. A respondent suggests it established a relationship of proximity that will pay off in the future. This is not a type of mutualism detached from the type of society we want. So this just to, you know, introduce what we are speaking when we are referring to these care practices that was the dominant form of activism that were adopted by young activists during the lockdown period and the early phase of the COVID-19. Digital activism also went up in terms of quantitative growth, but also in qualitative terms. Young activists from our fieldwork have emphasized several points concerning the quantitative growth of digital activism during the lockdown periods and its immediate aftermath. Digital technologies should not be used uncritically. They were suggesting, and that the critical reasoning behind like the adoption and the larger use of digital technologies during the lockdown was something that was stressed different times during the interview, and that was very interesting. And we were, given that we were able to like do these 2 rounds of interviews, was fascinating to see like that during the first round of interview, like in 2018, we were very much asking them like where they were like using digital technologies for their political participation, and most of them were like very reluctant to say like that they were using, even if we know that they were using, but they were not expressly like suggesting that that was one part of their activism. But obviously, like when the COVID and the lockdown measures were implemented, digital activism became one part of their activist life. The pandemic made me reevaluate how the internet can be used to expand the network of contacts even further. This is an interviewee from an alternative action organization that is involved in food gas type of activism. So if these 3 empirical observations were like all present in our respondents, as I was saying, like what has started to emerge from looking at these interviews was that we were getting different interpretation of these 3 empirical these themes. And by adopting a life course approach, we have started to analyze and try to understand how like these empirical these themes were working differently according to the different activists. Life course approach, we argue that the variation in activist trajectory of participation influence how they respond to critical events, because their sense-making process lead to the development of their subjective interpretation through a combination of individual factors, individual level factors. Here, the individual level factors for those who are working on political participation are the main factors that are recognized by the literature, and particularly we were using for building our analytical framework the literature on persistence and disengagement from political participation, and looking at how like resources, social networks, and collective efficacy have been used as factors that explain participation. The presence and silency of these factors vary across activist trajectory of participation, being more or less present and relevant, thus resulting in different sense-making process and subsequent response. So depending on the presence of these factors, activists who were like in had a different trajectory of participation, were interpreting their sense-making process differently, like the critical event, the COVID crisis, and subsequently responding differently to the crisis. Building on an inductive, deductive way of approaching our subject, we distinguish 4 prototypical trajectory of participation among our 16 activists we have met in the second round of interviews. We have the persistent activists, that are those who stayed within the same organization where we have met them in 2018. So they didn't change. We have transferred activists before the crisis, so those who have transferred from one organization to another one, but before the crisis. We have activists in abeyance before the crisis, and these are activists who have left the organization where we have met in 2018. They didn't disengage completely from political participation, but they have disengaged from membership in organization, and they are saying that they were saying that they were willing to come back to activism, but for that period of time they were like better like in a situation of political participation without an affiliation to an organization. And we have an activist in abeyance because of the crisis, who is actually the only one who has shifted her trajectory of participation given the reason of because of the crisis. So I will present those 4 types of trajectories and 4 types of activists in consideration to the 3 empirical observations, 3 topics that we have mentioned earlier. So the time reappropriation, the care practice, and the digital activism. The persistent activists, who were like, by the way, the greatest number of our respondents, who have high level of resources, numerous social networks, and good sense of collective efficacies because of their persistence within the same organization. They have they claim that they kept that they are persistent within the organization, kept them on track during the difficult period of the lockdown. And the COVID crisis was interpreted as instrumental in reappropriating their time. That was, you know, their answer to how like the COVID has affected their life. The organization were already using the care practice before the pandemic crisis, and once the crisis has exploded, it was somehow natural to rely on this type of practice once again. So these were activists who were like somehow like suggesting that they were not surprised by the crisis, that they were expecting a similar crisis, not the pandemic, but a structural crisis that was also framed within like an anti-capitalist discourse. They underlined a positive impact of digital activism during the periods of confinement. So digital activism allowed them and their organization to expand the personal and community network with other activists, something that was not present back in 2019. Transferred the activists before the crisis, so those who have left the organization where we have met them in 2018, but they joined another organization before of the crisis, show a very similar answer with a persistent activist. What differs this activist is the collective efficacy. They interpreted the renewed use of care practices and their dominant relevance during the lockdown as a further validation that their decision to join another organization, with one that had already adopted care practices before the pandemic crisis, was the right one, finally enabling them to make a contribution towards something meaningful in the changing context. So these were activists that where we have met in 2018, were in an organization that were not adopting care practice. They wanted to join organizations that were adopting care practice. They joined this organization before the crisis, and when the crisis arrived, they were between brackets, happy to be in an organization that was confirming that they did well to move from an organization that was not using care practice to an organization that was using care practice, because that was allowing them, when the crisis arrived, to be able to change the context and to be somehow helpful during the COVID crisis, and be see their activism as producing some change. Different is the answer that we have received from activists in abeyance before the crisis, and the activist that was in abeyance because of the crisis. The activists in abeyance before the crisis show low level of resources, few social networks, and medium faith in collective efficacy. The lockdown period functioned as a further confirmation that their previous decision to withdraw from the organization they were involved with was the right one, because of the time pressure. So these were few activists who were leaving their the organization where we have met back in 2018, because they were feeling that the time pressure, because of study reason, because of need of traveling, because of moving to another country, because of need to stay with a partner, was motivating them to leave the organization where they were involved. And this was further confirmed when the lockdown happened, because they were seeing how much the pressure of the society where we live, where they live, was asking them to accelerate their life and to ask them multiple things at the same time. So the lockdown was allowing them to further think about, to reflect and to have the time to do things that we're not doing during the weeks and months before the COVID crisis. Care practices. Care practices were considered from these activists as some possible form of action that would or might encourage them to participate in the near future. So these are activists who are very much listening what is going on in the activist world, but they are not anymore active in an organization. But what they were saying is, if we will come back to a membership in an organization, we will go back to an organization that will use care practice. And this is also a criticism toward the organization where they were previously, where we have met in 2018, that was not using care practice. They regarded the online tools as a means by which they could stay informed and participate without committing to a specific organization. So the digital, the online tools and the online contest was allowing them to keep in contact with the discussion that was going on in the activist world, and that was something that was in their view positive, because they were not losing connection and relation to what was going on in their previous world, the world of activism. Then there is an activist that represents somehow the only one among our sample of interviews that has shifted her form of activism because of the crisis, that went in abeyance because of the crisis. She felt burnout because of the explosion of the crisis and what her organization was asking during the early weeks of the crisis. So she needed to leave the organization, but with the willingness to come back when she would feel better and feel that she could provide energies and resources for activism. Interesting for her, digital activism in relation to political participation was highly criticized. Actually, she felt that the shift to from the offline to the online in the early weeks of the lockdown was something that was done improperly from her organization, and for that reason she was very critical, and this was the reason why she decided to leave the organization. So to conclude, we suggest that this work we have conducted somehow has some empirical and analytical contribution or results. At the empirical level, we suggest that there is no major shift in the trajectory of participation, that three major empirical observations emerge in relation to time reappropriation, care practice, and digital activism. And that these major empirical observations work differently according to the trajectories of participation. So these are the empirical observation and results of this study. At the analytical level, beyond the COVID crisis, we suggest that rather than looking for causal factor, as usually the literature is doing and has done, in particular in relation to critical events, we have reconstructed trajectories of participation to challenge the idea that there is only one way in which activists respond to critical events. We add the diachronic dimension, meaning that it looks for, we look at explanation as to how activist trajectories of participation influence their sense-making process and their responses to critical events. We also suggest that rather than tracing activists in context throughout their long periods of activism, this work looks at sudden critical events that happen over a short period of time. And this is, we think, a contribution to the literature on trajectory of participation and life history interviews that have usually suggested changes that are occurring over long time periods. We suggest that there are also critical events happening in very short time that are affecting the life of people, and in this case, young activists. And we suggest that the same critical events affect different activists in different ways according to the different trajectories of participation. I conclude. I stop the presentation.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I'll join you there so I can see if there is anyone from home that wants to ask questions. But meanwhile, we can start here in the room, maybe. Anyone? Can I just check on hi at home? If you is it this one? Hello, everyone at home. Do you have any questions for Lorenzo? Comments, debates, and maybe let's stop the recording as well. No?